Well, the World Cup is here, and I am currently committing a handball. In honor of this tournament, which is truly the pinnacle of the greatest sport on Earth, I thought we would cover a newish movie from one of the greatest directors on Earth. I think he's from Earth, at least. No, it's not Neil Breen. Today we're talking about Paolo Sorrentino, Diego Maradona, and The Hand of God. Now, if there's one thing to know about Paolo Sorrentino, it's that he directed The Great Beauty, a movie that I love more than life itself, maybe. An incredible work of art, The Great Beauty. First things first, The Hand of God is quite different, but also quite similar. On the surface, it's not going to seem much like The Great Beauty at all, but we're going to try and go a bit beneath the surface and see some ways in which it maybe connects. You'll see a lot of people saying that this movie is a much more personal movie, The Hand of God. And it's true that this is largely an autobiographical story about Sorrentino's coming of age, his discovery of cinema, and his seminal obsession with Maradona. But even if you don't know that this is a true story, I think it's still going to feel more personal than The Great Beauty, because it has much more of a narrative. It's kind of funny. I think that personal feeling isn't so much from the fact that it happens to be true, but from some of the style of the film. Although it's probably the case that the fact that it is true influenced the style of the movie, and that it's made in a certain way because of that. Fair enough. Point is, this is much more of a normal movie than The Great Beauty. Probably a much more accessible movie. To be honest, I was a little bit disappointed when I started to realize this. But for some people, it might be good news. If The Great Beauty is too abstract, too weird, too boring, too pretentious for you, well, this could be better. Unfortunately for you, I will be talking about The Great Beauty a lot in this movie. Another case of accidentally reviewing the wrong film, I think. But Sorrentino leaves some of his characteristic hallmarks out in this movie. For instance, The Great Beauty features some of the greatest and the most beautiful cinematography that you will ever see. The Hand of God looks good, but it's a lot less conspicuous. The camera kind of tries to get out of the way. Since The Great Beauty is so abstract and has basically no story, it is propelled forward mostly by its style. Incredibly slick and stylish movie. This movie has a story, and the style is a bit more subdued. The style is maybe in service of that. I'm trying not to drone on about The Great Beauty too much. Someday, I'll just work up the guts to do a review of that movie exclusively, but today is not that day. To be clear, The Hand of God is good. It is just a bit different. That said, not totally different. Some of Sorrentino's characteristic traits are shared between the two movies. Even though the cinematography isn't very flashy, for instance, it's still a great movie to look at, mainly because it makes use of tons of incredible locations. This movie is set in Naples, where Sorrentino grew up, and you can really tell that he knows the streets. The Great Beauty is similar. It's a movie that lives on location, that is inseparable from the city that it is set in. The Hand of God also has Sorrentino's trademark oddness. Lots of little moments showing you things that you don't really expect to see. This is another thing that kind of propels the movie forward, just sort of these curious little snippets coming together. The beginning of this movie, for instance, features a woman waiting at a bus stop. When a big old car stops, and an old man gets out and convinces her to get in. He takes her to some kind of decrepit mansion where there's a beautiful chandelier on the floor, and where they meet the little monk. The woman bends over to kiss the little monk's forehead. The man grabs her from behind. The monk blesses her and apparently cures her infertility. This is kind of a weird way to start a movie. It reminds me of some of the odd rituals that we see in The Great Beauty. Now, a lot of movies that are set in the 1980s are going to open up with some big synth chords and a bunch of Dayglow tracksuits. They're going to throw the decade in our face. First things first, buddy. It's the 80s. That's what's important. This movie doesn't do that at all. And here it's not really even clear what year it is until well into the movie. The old man's car is something classic. The city is old. The clothes aren't trendy. And this thing about the little monk, which is apparently a saying in Naples, a sign of good luck, more or less, this seems kind of ancient. We're opening the movie up on pseudo-traditional grounds, pious grounds, although the man also takes advantage of her. So this is kind of an unstable start to the movie. Who are these people? What do they believe? More importantly, maybe, is this question of what we're looking at. Is this a hallowed tradition that we should be looking onto with reverence? Or is it some bizarre artifact of a bygone time, something that we should be laughing at? This movie often teeters between reverence and farce. This is where we come back to some of the ideas of the great beauty, I think, particularly that finding meaning is tricky and that the meaning of a lot of things is tenuous. Meaningful at certain times to certain people, baffling at other times or to other people. This kind of dynamic of the film only works because of Sorrentino's, one of his big virtues, I think, which is that he's not judgmental. Like I said, it's not clear what we're supposed to be thinking about this opening. This is not a morality play. This is not a didactic movie. Sorrentino really never tips his hand as to whether his characters are wise or naive, brilliant or foolish. And this really opens up the movie. Let's talk about another weird thing in the movie. In one of the early scenes, a big group of family and friends is waiting for one of their friends, acquaintances, to come with her new boyfriend. Everybody's anxious to see him. They're all talking about what he's going to be like, what they're going to say to him. There's kids set up with their binoculars, peering down the road to try and catch a glimpse of this guy as early as they can. Now, minor spoiler here, but it turns out that he has an artificial voice box, the kind of thing you might use if you had throat cancer. This is unexpected. What's the point? Partly, it just shakes things up, I think. Mainly, this twist is played as comedy, with the guy struggling to take part in conversations and activities, doing his best, but ending up looking kind of goofy. On the other hand, part of you is probably going to feel like they're mistreating the guy. And maybe you'll be chuckling, laughing at some of these moments, but you might also be looking behind you, wondering if you should be laughing, wondering if there's cruelty here and if there's systemic cruelty, mistreatment of the disabled or something like that. Well, the movie doesn't really lean on the scale too much. It doesn't really take sides too much. There seems to be naivete all around, but also earnestness. There is something vaguely wholesome about this guy sticking it out for his new girlfriend, and also about the family joking with each other and giving the new guy a hard time and sticking up for their friend. I said earlier that this movie kind of teeters between reverence and farce, and in some ways, that's not so different from this coexistence of the earnest and the naive. We're just kind of winging it here, you know? I'm not saying that you should go out and bully the disabled, or that the movie endorses it. And I do think there are a couple of places here and there where it maybe leans on the scale a little bit, a couple of places where it kind of gives you a didactic touch. But for the most part, it doesn't. And I think the most powerful moments are when it's open like this, but also when you can see doubt flicker through the characters. When Saverio, the father in this movie, looks at this new guy with the voice box, and you can just see for a moment he's thinking about how they should be treating him. You can also see it for a second when the voice box guy, I forget his name, just takes a moment to weigh up if it's worth it to him to be sitting in the boat while everybody else is swimming, to not really be fitting in. Interesting. We'll see him later in the movie. It's not a major plot point, but he sneaks into a few scenes, and you see a little bit of how this develops. It's interesting. And it turns out that his voice box is going to take on a certain metaphorical significance towards the end of the movie as well. I will mention that this even-handedness, which I really like, could put some people off the movie. This movie features some really dysfunctional relationships, some domestic abuse, and the movie, for the most part, watches it happen. Like I said, I think it maybe leans on the scale a little bit here and there, but if you're looking for a moralistic, didactic movie, or any kind of political movie, this isn't it. This is not it. It's probably about time to mention that this is a coming-of-age age movie. Talk about what actually happens, I guess. There's kind of two things that Fabietto, the kid at the center of the story, the young version of Sorrentino, I guess, is on the verge of discovering. One of them is the responsibilities of adulthood. Gotta love that. And the other one is cinema. Even though it might not look like it at first, this movie, like The Great Beauty, kind of is a search for a higher calling, kind of is a search for something that matters, something that is worth a lifetime's energy. I think that a lot of Sorrentino's films traverse a spectrum of malaise and inspiration. Forget about the hero's journey. These movies start with someone who is happy enough, seemingly engaged with their life, but it's a life that is somewhat superficial. It's a life that has some cracks in it. It's somewhat diffuse. Then something happens to really bring on the malaise, to reveal how meaningless, perhaps, or just how tenuous the meaning in their life was. Things start to feel meaningless, and our hero is then going to search for inspiration. It's going to be tricky. He's going to investigate things other people find inspiring. He's not going to find them inspiring. But eventually, maybe, he stumbles his way towards something. This describes this movie. It also describes The Great Beauty, same story. I'll say that it describes Youth, another Sorrentino film, although honestly, I don't remember what happens in that movie. But I think there's maybe also another axis here that deals with time a little bit, looking to the past, looking to the future. A lot of Italian movies are really nostalgic, and this is no different. Fabietto has some trouble looking towards the future. This gets all tangled up in his search for meaning. Is meaning in the future or is meaning in the past? Hard to know. In The Great Beauty, Jep Gambardella spends a lot of time recalling his youth, particularly a midnight excursion to an island, where he has one of his earliest sexual encounters. We spend a lot of time on islands in this movie, too. A lot of time hearing footsteps echoing on the pavement at night. This kind of feels meaningful, doesn't it? Nighttime in a city, nighttime on an island, nighttime on the ocean. Feels meaningful both in the film and in life. So on the surface, we've got some latent meaning. It's not just spiritual inspiration and artistic inspiration, but we can also be inspired by the night and the city and nature. It can be totally captivating, but also a bit confounding. There's also, in this movie, sexual inspiration, which ends up being a huge kind of idea here. Why does Jep, in The Great Beauty, why does he always think back to this encounter, to this early sexual experience? In some ways, I think that those island memories kind of stand for this entire movie, for this coming of age, for this discovery of adult meaning. And sexual discovery is a big part of this movie. There's a lot of sexualization of older women, which lends some ambivalence to the idea of sexual inspiration. Is it something profound, or is it something very basic? Is it an urge we should fight? It's animalistic, unrefined, or is it something we should embrace because it's natural? Mothers have an enormous role in this movie. There's a lot to be said about the role of the mother and of sexualized older women in Italian culture. But because I don't really know anything about Italian culture, I'm not going to dive in here. I also don't want this video to be an hour long. But this is kind of an obvious theme of the movie. And like I said, if you've seen The Great Beauty, those scenes on the island, those kind of stand in for this entire movie, this idea of a certain, well, first of all, like I said, there's a temporal axis, so this idea of looking back, this meaning of the past, but also this kind of discovery of adult responsibilities, this early sexual inspiration, but also sort of the natural divinity, natural inspiration of a beautiful place and a night. Okay. It's probably time to talk about Maradona. If you don't know, this movie takes its name from a goal scored by Maradona against England in the quarterfinal of the 1986 World Cup. Although it kind of looked like Maradona headed the ball past an onrushing goalkeeper, he in fact punched the ball with his hand. The referee didn't notice, and this was long before video review, so the goal stood. Maradona would go on to score the so-called goal of the millennium later in the game. Argentina would win. They won the whole thing that year. Minor spoiler, if you haven't yet seen the 1986 World Cup. I strongly recommend. If you didn't know better, you might think that a movie called The Hand of God would completely revolve around the goal, that characters would be betting their life savings on that game, that Maradona would directly inspire the characters to start punching other things, right? To start taking things into their own hands or something like that. You would expect basically the goal to be a plot device. But in this movie, that's really not the case. Instead, the hand of God is yet another example of inspiration, but confusing inspiration, confounding inspiration, unstable inspiration, baffling inspiration that people want to co-opt for their own purposes, right? One of the characters says that the hand of God is a political act. It's kind of clear when you're watching the movie that we're not supposed to be taking this at face value. The hand of God, is it really a political act? The religious connotations are kind of obvious. Again, this is a movie that teeters between reverence and farce. Is the point of the movie that this is just a silly game? Right? Why does everybody ascribe so much meaning to this? People just kicking things around, this guy just punching the ball in. It's so goofy. It's all a farce. He used his hand. I mean, come on. Or is the point that there's nothing more important, nothing more meaningful? Look at all the people it brought together, and look at the maverick maneuver. He used his hand. What a god, right? Reverence or farce? The answer is not obvious. Maradona actually shows up in youth as well a little bit. Obviously, he was a huge figure for Sorrentino, but there's almost a sort of sheepishness to his obsession. What kind of idol is Maradona? Is he really someone we should be looking up to? Is he really someone we should be thinking of as a god? In some ways, maybe he's not so different from the little monk. Besides Maradona, we see some other historical characters in the movie. Fabiano takes this midnight trip to Capri with his new friend Arma, a fantastic character in this movie. And there they see Adnan Khashoggi, at the time one of the richest men in the world, and his wife Lamia Khashoggi. Arma can't remember her name, but he kind of recognizes them. Interestingly, the wife of Khashoggi, in real life, she changed her name when she got married, dropping her Italian name and picking up this Muslim one. So maybe there's something political in Arma's failing memory, an interesting little nod there to somebody not recognizing their heritage, perhaps. Sorrentino's films, I think, often strike kind of a glancing blow at history, right? They've got historical moments, niche celebrities, these little details of the past, but the characters often misinterpret these moments, or they don't pay attention to them. They're looking the other way, right? Some of the characters, they're not watching the television when Maradona scores. They misinterpret the moments, and, they can't even remember who the celebrities are. This is kind of the opposite of how historical films are supposed to operate, where there's a certain didacticism of place and time, where there's something we are supposed to see, something we came to see. Like I said, this movie doesn't throw the 80s in our face, and it doesn't really put history to the forefront at any moment either. Feels a bit like the present, where it's actually quite easy to ignore history. And it just gives you this little idea that maybe historical inspiration as well is a little bit suspect. And it's not so easy to crown certain moments as profound, important things. Do they really matter? What kind of an idol is the past? Something we should be reverent of? Or is it just a bit of a farce? A bit like The Little Monk? I just want to mention a few more things. First, Fabiano's older brother, Marquino, played by Marlon Joubert, is one of the highlights of the movie for me. I won't go through this whole subplot, but it's really special. Incredible storyline. One of my favorite parts of the movie. And shout out to Stromboli, the island, and the movie, and the food, one of which makes an appearance in this film. I want to mention that there's also a few criminals in this movie who are mainly apprehended. This reminds me a little bit of Jep's neighbor in The Great Beauty, who turns out to be some sort of gangster or something. This, again, is not a very moralistic movie here. It's not saying that crime doesn't pay, right? The idea is not that crime doesn't pay, but that crime is banal. Crime is not some higher calling. Maybe sometimes criminals feel like they're breaking the system, like they have a type of agency that law-abiding citizens don't. But here we see, perhaps it's really just part of the malaise that most people have to slog through. There isn't something to special about it. So what is special? Does this movie deliver us to some higher calling? Does it tell us some secret to a meaningful life? Well, like The Great Beauty, I think it gives a somewhat tentative answer. It shows us one person seeming to find inspiration, but it's a somewhat sober inspiration. It's not clear that it's anything divine. This movie isn't a blueprint for how everyone can live their life, but maybe it's a story about how if you take enough wrong turns and you go through enough hardships and you just kind of live enough, maybe you'll find something that is meaningful. At one point, Fabiano says that he's only seen 3 films. Does he know what he's getting into when he sort of becomes interested in cinema? Does he know what will happen? It's possible that his interest in filmmaking was lit by seeing the respect that directors get, or the women that they get to direct. Not exactly an intellectual setting out saying, this is why I chose film. And just like you kind of expect the hand of God, the goal, to be a plot device, you also kind of expect in this movie that's telling you why Sorrentino became a film director, you kind of expect him to tell you why he became a film director. But that's not in this movie. Instead, it's just kind of a series of events that lead to that happening, where it's clear that he finds something meaningful to it, but there's no obvious fortune cookie. There's no facile description of, this is why I like cinema. This is what is important about cinema. Fellini is in this movie, sort of. We have another glancing blow with history here where Marchino has an audition with Fellini. We don't really see him, but afterwards, Marchino tells Fabiano that the director told him something about cinema. He said that it was all about an escape from the dull, an escape from the diffuse reality, the complicated reality. A way out of malaise into inspiration. This seems to resonate with Fabiano, and it fits with a certain image of early Italian cinema. Think about the movies that people go to see in Cinema Paradiso. But I think it would be a big mistake to think that Sorrentino is telling us that this is his calling, that this is his inspiration, that this is what movies are about. Sorrentino's films are hardly escapist in themselves. Maybe they take you away someplace to Naples or Rome, but they're intensely introspective. His goal is not simply to distract people, and neither, in truth, is Fellini's. So one of the central ideas of this film, the inspiration of cinema, is kind of left a bit fuzzy for us, left like all the other ambiguous inspirations in this movie. Like I said, you expect to know, you expect to learn what the magic of cinema is. What is the reason? What's the point? Just like maybe you expect to learn what the great beauty is, or if it exists in the great beauty. And these answers are simply not forthcoming, and that's kind of the point. Cinematic inspiration, just as ambiguous as a lot of other forms of inspiration. Really, Sorrentino and Fellini have a lot in common. As I was talking earlier about all these odd moments that come together, the tableau of the city and such, maybe you were thinking about this. If Fellini was still alive, he perhaps would be making movies like The Hand of God. This movie is quite different from some of Sorrentino's earlier works, like I've said, but Fellini also had a sprawling career making tons of different movies. So even if you were hoping for another great beauty, I think you will still like this movie. Like I said, it actually is kind of about a lot of the similar things, and I also think you might enjoy seeing Sorrentino's career continue to grow. So that's The Hand of God. Like I said, a more normal movie and a more accessible movie in some ways, but still a deeply meaningful film. I think a subtle film, a very open film, focusing on a lot of similar ideas, or at least I'm projecting the same ideas onto both of these movies. But in general, I would recommend this as long as you kind of know what you're getting into a little bit.